There's a lot of apples in the world. It's amazing how many have become extinct.
I'm the Indiana Jones of apples. The other holy grail is called the Fremont apple.
To me, they're just beautiful.
Wyoming's heritage apples on this Farm to Fork, Wyoming.
I know that they're out there.
Production of Farm to Fork, Wyoming is made possible with the generous support of the Wyoming Business Council Agribusiness Division and viewers like you. Thank you.
And there is something rather special about this. So many people come out here and they just, oh, this is paradise. There is a special feeling out here.
When you think of the Rockies, and Wyoming in particular, apple orchards are one of the last things that come to mind.
When I came out west, and I was looking over the neighbor's yard, and I was just like those look like apples. And it never occurred to me that in the Mountain West, in the Rocky Mountains, the apple trees.
Yet the apple is no stranger to Wyoming.
You know, so I went over and I talked to the neighbor, and he's like, oh no, it's like really good for the trees in the garden.
And there's just such a level of complexity.
It's just cross-pollination, and the bees love it, and it keeps everything happy, and blah, 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 blah.
There's room and place for just about anything that's out here. Can find food, shelter, nourishment, water, protection. So I think it's kind of a magic place that way.
Apple trees and fruit trees, you know, in general are like very necessary, and they're a very positive part of the whole little microcosm of a large scale or small scale agricultural thing. You know, they're supposed to be there. You know, they're actually really supposed to be there.
The apple has accompanied us for thousands of years now.
There are crab apples native to North America, but no sweet apples. So every single big apple tree that you see in North America came from somewhere else. This Malus sieversii from the Tianshan Mountains of China, Kazakhstan, the high mountain areas there, is probably the ancestor of the modern sweet apple. From there, it moved along the Silk Road, moved along all of the trade routes. It eventually ended up into the Middle East and then into Europe. And then, of course, when we came here from Europe, it's one of the first things that we brought was also the apple. Okay. And so many of the cultivars that you find on the East Coast are actually European in origin. There's also another route from Spain into South America and up through Mexico. And so some of the apple cultivars that you find in the Southwest probably originated in a different place than the ones that we have in more northerly areas.
Thanks to hardworking generations of homesteaders, the remains of 100-plus-year-old orchards are scattered across Wyoming.
Just about everywhere in the state, there is at least one big orchard that people would know about.
You discover all these things about all these people that had an apple tree and planted it and what they did with it. So it's just part of this wonderful history that we have here in Wyoming.
You know, the first orchard in Wyoming was the Ed Young Orchard, and it was planted in about 1872.
He was king of apples for quite a number of years.
I suspect that Ed Young had this sense with where the river was, with the surrounding canyons and the wind direction, that this would be just a perfect place for the orchard.
He had over 3,000 trees at one point.
Located just a few miles outside of Lander, Ed Young had a good customer base for his sizable orchard.
Lander was one of the largest but most isolated cities in Wyoming.
It was all local, you know, and then of course they sent a lot of apples via the mule trains that went up Red Canyon Road to South Pass.
That was an added market that others joined him in doing.
He picked and sold apples in the bushel, and he made the cider.
He took his apples to the state fair in Douglas.
He did well at the state fairs with his wealthies, I know especially.
He gave lectures on where to plant trees, how to plant trees, and also the varieties.
It's interesting, there are very few apple trees out there that are like any of the others out there. We have one row of wealthies, and then we found 3 identical ones over on the other side of the manager's house. But the rest are all practically their own apple. So whether he saved seedlings, whether he got a scion from somewhere else and grafted it, but there's very few duplicates out there.
Picking up on the already established orchards around the Lander area, the University of Wyoming established its own experimental orchard in nearby Sinks Canyon.
They planted the orchard in 1892, and they did their first fruit-bearing assessment in 1895.
The whole idea behind developing the ones for Wyoming was very important because people wanted to have things that were developed specifically for the Rocky Mountains, specifically for the bad winters, specifically for the dry, summers and things like that. So inherently, people were very interested to have cultivars developed in Wyoming.
This tree came from a seed.
Okay.
So it's like the seedlings that they were trying to propagate down at the field station. And this produces a beautiful apple.
Okay.
And I think just like in those early years when they were trying to develop new varieties for Wyoming, that they would have selected a seedling like this. It would be a winner. Yeah. And that was one of the goals, is to have apples that would keep for long periods of time. Of course, now people don't generally do that. This is a heritage.
Oh, what is it?
20 ounce.
That's what it's called?
And so we don't find our apples at the market from these heritage trees.
Reliable, locally grown food was needed for Wyoming's growing populations. And the University of Wyoming saw the apple playing an important part.
Avon Nelson, who's the namesake of the botany building here, was the secretary of the State Horticulture Society. He wrote a very impassioned plea about orchards, and he was very emphatic. It's really, really interesting to read. If you don't have an orchard, plant one. If you have an orchard, make it bigger. If you don't have a good orchard, make it better, and he just went on and on and on about, the value of the orchard.
A lot of the pioneers that came here, the early homesteaders, brought trees with them, or they ordered them quite quickly because there was no fresh produce.
Ranchers all over the state, for one reason or another, would start an orchard.
You can actually trace ranches in progression where various ranchers, farmers adopted farmer ranch orchards.
There were a lot of commercial orchard enterprises up around Sheridan, for example, and there's still a lot of remnants up there. I know about 3 or 4 that are very large.
And that was very common because this in the old days was their only source of fresh fruit, and apples do keep well.
And then when the different irrigation projects moved in, that allowed people to grow things that they couldn't grow before. And apple orchards was one of the first things. Powell, I know 4 or 5 big orchards up in Powell, very old orchards, not only from homesteading, but also from a commercial enterprise. They would grow apples and sell them, or squeeze cider and sell the ciders. There was a big orchard up in Tinsleep. It's now operated by a church camp up there. And you wouldn't think, that Laramie would be the best place to grow apples at 7,200 feet, but apples were so important to people that they would find a way to grow the apples.
It's remarkable how a simple tree could answer so many needs and deliver so much pleasure.
My favorite pie,
Really?
this apple.
So juice.
There is such an extraordinary satisfaction to run out the back door, grab a few apples, pull a few onions, maybe find a few new potatoes with, say, a piece of deer meat that you got last fall.
Apples are like one of the greatest seasonal products because everything that goes with an apple is representative of the season they're grown, whether it's apple and parsnip or apple and sweet potato or apple and dried berry. You know, it's just they're this great little sponge of all that is fall.
And for all its pleasure, the apple came with a practical side as well.
So they make this one little thing amazingly diverse.
The uses of the apple for the pioneer was much more important. One of the best cleaning agents and disinfecting agents that you can come up with is vinegar. And so they, in the process of making apple cider, they would make some that turned to alcohol, some that would turn to, lactic acid and other things, and vinegar. So, we used to not be able to buy pectin to make jelly. If you wanted to make jelly, you had to have apples, even crab apples, because you could extract the pectin by cooking it and straining out, and so you could add that to preserves and make a jelly out of it.
So there's all these really neat applications if you take the time to think about it and look at it and understand it.
They're juicier apples, so for cider pressing and juice pressing, there are apples that really maintain a lot of moisture on the inside. There are apples that have better cider.
See, this one makes the best cider.
Yeah,
You put this with a couple of sweet ones, when the complexity just, it would be.
The flavors that they have are a little tangier or a little sweeter or whatever.
There are apples out there that have the same sort of character than, say, a Meyer lemon, less acidity, which a lot of times can be good, but can still do the exact same thing that everybody wants to do with lemons, you can do with fresh apple juice.
There are pie apples that get soft fairly quickly.
Some apples don't ever cook. Some apples, you really only want to cook them. Honeycrisp you can cook, but I actually think you lose a lot of what makes a Honeycrisp when you cook it. Leave those raw.
Like yellow transparent. It's been one of the best ones for applesauce because, you pick that apple and it's nearly applesauce right in the beginning. It's got really good flavor, but it doesn't have much of a texture. It's not that good for eating. It's kind of soft and that sort of thing. So it's good to eat, but they're best for cooking like applesauce and things like that.
And then there's even how you fabricate some of them due to densities. So Macintosh, you can put on a slicer and go paper thin because the cell densities are so small, the cells are so tight that you can make these things paper thin, almost translucent. Whereas Braeburn, not so much, because the cells are a little bit bigger and you end up slicing through the whole thing. It goes brown really fast, falls apart, it starts to flake up.
Other uses for it would be animal feed, dried apples.
Some apples hardly have any juice. Baking apples. I can run them through the juicer and all I get is this pile of dry pulp and about 4 little drops of, juice at the bottom of the cup. That can make those really good, or stewing them, or applesauce, apple butters, because you can still caramelize them, and they actually caramelize a little faster because you're not waiting for all the water to evaporate out of them. They're also a lot of times good dried.
And some just inherently store better. They're apples that I've stored for 9 months, and they're just as good as the day that I picked them. There are other ones that don't last really that long. So before the presence of, Safeway and other big box stores, you just go out to your apple orchard. Most people don't know the biology of the apple that much. You go to upstate New York and you eat an apple and it's just to die for. And so you secret away the seeds, you come back and you plant them and you baby that tree for 10 years and you finally get an apple and you taste it. It doesn't taste anything like what you remember. Why is that? Well, that's because it's not the fertilization event that causes the taste. The fertilization event causes the fruit to develop, but it's the tree itself that creates the taste and the flesh of the apple. And that's why we have to graft. Because if you want this apple and this flesh, you have to take it from the tree rather than from the seed. You know, grafting goes back 3,000 years, so they knew how to graft a long, long time ago.
Not only did grafting perpetuate the desired flesh of an apple, it was a way to control how large or small the cultivar would grow.
I never recommend that people grow dwarf trees around here because they're dwarf because the roots are not very strong. So physiologically, they're not capable of providing the nutrients and the water and stuff to make it a big tree so that it stays small. And that means that they're just naturally weak.
Wyoming's surviving apple trees owe their endurance in part to the large rootstocks favored by the pioneers.
When they're on this Russian rootstock, they can grow, for the most part, 20, 30 feet tall without batting an eyelash. And they're so hardy, and the roots go down and they survive. We went 11 years here in this drought, and the orchard didn't get any water, and we still had apples.
These tall-growing trees offer an abundance of fruit, but that only comes with ongoing care.
Apple trees have to be renewed with pruning. They just grow like anything else to maturity, and then they sit there, and then they gradually decline.
The thing about pruning standard trees, because they're no longer really planted, all of the commercial orchards are dwarf or semi-dwarf, and they require very little pruning. And pruning these kinds of trees is totally different than what you would do on a semi-dwarf. And you can see there's multiple large branches. You tend to head them back so they don't get way out. And then you open up the center of the tree so the sunlight will come in so that you get a nice red apple. And if you don't, then you end up with apples that don't have the kind of color you would like to have to the appeal. I mean, if you were doing this commercial, you'd much rather have this apple to sell than this apple. And the other thing that pruning does is it helps increase the size. You would get apples, a lot of apples like this when the trees are properly pruned. If they're not, you end up with a lot of apples like this.
It's just astronomical now. It's about $300 a tree to bring in a professional arborist to do it.
So it's become a lost art, really. Very few people really understand how to prune these trees.
It's no wonder we've neglected these old friends.
But we've lost all but 2 in this row, and then there's 2 more there. So we're losing a lot of them.
Between the time that we settled this country and now, I've read that there were almost 16,000 different cultivars, and now we're down around 4,000 or 5,000. So we've lost 10 or 12,000.
Well, these apples won't ship. You know, I can barely get in the house and plunk a bucket down, and there's some bruises. So but the skin is so fragile and wonderful that I never take the skin off. And that's where the mineralization occurs that gives the apples sometimes a special flavor. Some of the red apples, it'll turn the applesauce pink. And that's kind of a jolly thing to find out when you've cooked it up.
These old apples are really quite rich in all kinds of vitamins and antioxidants in the skins and so on.
I really think we need to be seriously considering what we're going to do with these apples. We need to have more interest locally in eating local apples, even though they don't look as shiny and pretty as they do in the store from Washington and Oregon and California and so forth.
And if you've been lucky enough to enjoy old-fashioned apple varieties right off the tree, you never forget the wonderful flavors.
It's just like the human beings walking down the street. Everybody is different. And the flavors, you know, one apple you'll think, I don't like that. And somebody will come along, oh my God, is that ever good? You know, it's a personal thing.
It's no wonder that people don't like to eat apples. Most apples that you buy at the store are 14 to 18 months old by the time you get them. Even in the best of times, an 18-month-old apple is not going to be the same as you know, a fresh apple. So the grow local is very important to me, and apples fit right into that.
That's one unique thing. When Yellowstone went off, you know, it spread all this wonderful mineral for thousands of miles, and we have that here. So I think that contributes to the flavor. The French call it terroir of the soil. And so what we have here tastes so good.
Oh, there's no doubt that the same varieties planted in different locations produce apples that sometimes are totally different in flavor.
I want to go to farmers markets anywhere in the state and eat the local apples that they have.
So, you know, everything sort of has its taste, and there's more uses for it. I've got apples out there that you can slice, they never turn brown. They dry beautifully.
Sometimes the apples are salty, sometimes the apples are sweet, sometimes they're juicy, sometimes they're a little sour. But I want to go and be able to buy, in every community, I want to buy the local apple.
The flavor's there, the health is there, the goodness is there.
And the proven survivability of these old adapted breeds is important also.
A lot of those trees are the same trees that were producing, you know, back in the late, 1800s.
Seems like the selection for those old heritage varieties involved the ability to withstand cold, wind, sun scald, and snow load.
I think this is Haraldson, and it was developed specifically for winter hardiness and disease resistance. In those days, they didn't have chemicals that you could spray to prevent diseases, so they did it primarily through breeding for resistance.
And it's amazing how much cider you can make out there on good years. And of course, you never know from year to year, because sometimes we get these late hard freezes and snows when the blossoms are full and the bees don't pollinate. I have encourage the little small mason bees, and they will fly during cold weather and windy weather where the honeybees won't. So pollination does happen. It surprises me how much we get even when I think that we're not going to get anywhere.
And thankfully, there's a handful of stewards working to rescue Wyoming's remaining survivors.
And that's one of the reasons why I started this project. You know, apple trees can grow, there's some in Europe that are 300 years old, but they have been meticulously maintained and pruned and cared for, and you know, all of the pests and stuff taken care of. Most of the orchards around here, you could say almost with certainty that they've been abandoned at some point. Some of them for maybe as long as 100 years or 90 years. Those trees that are surviving now are 130 years old. They've survived drought, they've survived bad winters, they've survived all kinds of natural pests and everything, and they're still alive. And so that's why I started the project, to try to save and identify some of the cultivars, because they have to be the most valuable ones for different areas in Wyoming. One of the things that I want to find, and I know that the paperwork exists, but this director, George Steinbreck from Lander, kept very meticulous records. He kept all of that stuff, and shortly before he died, he donated it to a museum up in Lander, and they can't find it, okay? But in those records somewhere are all of the apples that he sent to particular farms.
And spread across the state are some dozen unique, market-worthy cultivars that Steinbreck had developed some 100+ years ago.
I know that they're out there, and so what I've been trying to do is to talk to people that have big ranches, and I gave a grafting workshop up in Powell, and these two gentlemen, an older gentleman and his son, came up afterwards and had this old piece of cardboard. And he said, you know, this is my grandfather's orchard. I'm not sure if you're interested in it. He opened it up, and the first 3 names that I saw were names from that list from Wyoming.
This Brickstein, Dr. Miller said, as far as he knows, that's the only one left that they know of. And then this Cortland, Margaret, and here's another Cortland.
As far as I know, they're the only ones that people know specifically about. The other holy grail is called the Fremont apple. That was one of the cultivars that they developed there, and it may still be on the place. You know, our molecular work will tell us, we'll be able to match up with heritage cultivars that are already in the database. But if we aren't able to identify it, it could be one of those novel cultivars. And it could be the Fremont apple. You know, we just don't know. But so that's I'm spreading the word as far as I can. You know, if you've ever heard of the Fremont apple, if somebody on your, you know, ranch or in your history may have talked about a Fremont apple, I'd really like to know about it.
Those gifts from the past are kind of pointing the way to the future, if we really stop and think about it. How much longer are we going to want to depend on all of this stuff coming in from California, who's struggling with water and drought and fire, or the Pacific Northwest, when we can grow it here?
I want nurseries in Wyoming to be selling apples that will grow in Wyoming and produce in Wyoming and last 130 years. That's really what I would like to do.
Whenever anybody plants a tree, it's for the next generation.
This episode of Farm to Fork Wyoming is available for $25. Order online at shop.wyomingpbs.org. This program was produced by Wyoming PBS, which is solely responsible for its content.